I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Yagara and Turrbal country, where sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm privileged to be a part of this discussion today because this is such an important and pivotal moment in our history as we begin as a nation to seriously engage with the challenge posed by that wonderfully evocative, powerful, generous and eloquent statement from the heart, written and agreed at Uluru 5 years ago by the overwhelming majority of Australia's First Nations leaders. An incapacity to face up to the truths of our colonial and indeed our post-colonial history and the shameful, bitter legacy of those truths has festered through more than 2 centuries, leaving a destructive hollowness at the core of this nation and all of us. To commit the invasion and the deep colonial injustice that followed is bad enough. It is quite another matter to then try to continue denying the undeniable, to continue to try to perpetuate what has been called the Great Australian Silence. And as Indigenous voices grew in their demand for truth to be told and the historians began to bring scholarship to the claims of massacres and frontier wars and state-sanctioned efforts to exterminate, under the guise of other seemingly less sinister words like dispersal, historians like Henry Reynolds and Ray Evans and others, and then later Lyndall Ryan and Jonathan Richards, the rearguard action began to try to discredit their work, to try to protect the great silence in the so-called history wars, trying to dismiss the growing evidence as a black armband view of history, or in the case of Keith Windshuttle, to discredit Indigenous oral history as tales my granny told me. The Australian Wars, conceived and produced by Blackfella Films and powerfully narrated by Rachel Perkins, painstakingly researched through a combination of archives, other records, and more recently, convincing forensic evidence as well as carefully distilled oral history, will shatter the great silence like nothing before it, as it relentlessly documents the evidence of Australia's first wars fought on contested Australian soil. And Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians will find it painful to absorb in different ways. To me, it will be the gateway to a much more sustained ongoing process of truth-telling of Makarrata that this nation not only has to have, but has to embrace. Today's conversation with our 4 panellists is designed to take you inside the layered research process that provided the facts and the insights for Rachel Perkins and her team of filmmakers to produce the Australian Wars. And a brilliant series it is. We're going to play a trailer from the series to give you a brief insight to help give texture to the discussion.
Just up the road from Canberra is this place, Lake George, known in the Ngunnawal language as Wiriwa. Here in the 1820s, there was a war. It was a small war, but it was part of a much greater war that lasted just over 100 years. But you wouldn't know it because there's no memorials here. And no memorials to the tens of thousands of Australians who lost their lives in the first wars. The nation is silent on the matter. The Great Australian Silence. My name's Rachel Perkins, and I have both European and Aboriginal heritage. I grew up knowing my Kalkadoon and Arrernte ancestors were killed in these wars. But like most Australians, I never learned this history at school. I'm a filmmaker, and my crew and I are travelling right across Australia, exploring the records, testimony, the facts of our history that the nation has turned its back on.
None of this was hidden. It was talked about in the news regularly.
We're talking about violence against people whose eyes you can see.
This is a story about battles fought on countless fronts. A war that, more than any other, made Australia what it is today. And yet a war that we still deny.
settlers were involved in an ongoing war for the occupation of Aboriginal lands.
We need to understand why the war was never declared, when clearly there were wars, plural, many wars.
It's time for a reckoning. Are we ready to honestly face the past that made our country what it is, or go on living a lie?
Welcome to you all, and I'd like to start with you, Jonathan. How hard a journey of discovery has it been for you as a historian? How hard to flush out and reveal the facts and the truths, and then deal with those who would seek to deny them?
Well, I'm lucky in that I'm a white man. So I've had the education, I've had the opportunities, I've had the privileges. And even though it was never easy, it was simply a case of starting and keeping on going. So it's not hard. Some of the material is certainly traumatic, but it's no harder than any other worthwhile task.
But tell me more about the pictures that emerged as you got deeper and deeper into the work, and it actually took shape as a huge story of our early colonial history.
It's the shattering of myths. I grew up in Queensland primary and secondary schools being told that this was a peacefully settled continent. Australia was the one place that never experienced a war. And I realise now that that was a lie. So to go back through our own national history and realise we'd been told a whole fanciful story, and the reality was actually a story of brutal conflict and inequality, made me stop and realise this is not the lucky country. Not for everyone.
What are the most compelling or important aspects of your work that your work has revealed about the nature of that violence, that colonial violence in Queensland, and reflected through the rest of the country?
I think the most astonishing thing is how well known the violence was, and how the denial is a much more recent system. And I really think it is a system, because it's education, it's the writing, the researching, the publication of history that had covered it up. But during the 19th century, it was quite well known throughout Queensland and most of the rest of Australia that this horrific violence was going on.
But a lot of your work is centred around the activities of the native police. Just give us a bit of background on how the native police came into being and what their purpose was and how they were led.
Well, the native police are a standard colonial formation. There is similar bodies exist in every other part of empire and every other empire. It was called divide and rule, using Indigenous men to crush other Indigenous resistance. So there's nothing special about the native police in Queensland. If you look in other parts of Australia, you will find similar bodies, just given different names. And there is no doubt that they were a huge factor in the dispossession and the destruction of Aboriginal people and their culture. But there is a much more complex story that does still need to be told of the good colonists, the people who stood up to defend Aboriginal people. Also, there is a much more important story that needs to be told about the broader colonisation and how it was not a gentle process, and how it was all about land and resources and inequality, and it's still with us today.
So can I ask you to talk about the Hornet Bank massacre or the Hornet Bank killings that led to a widespread retaliation, just as an illustration of how the process worked and what was behind it, and the extent to which it is clear that the state was complicit.
1857, Aboriginal people on the Dawson River were experiencing violence from Europeans. They resisted, and in particular, they attacked the Hornet Bank station. The consequence of that resistance was an almighty genocidal ethnic cleansing of the landscape, where literally hundreds of Aboriginal people were killed and dislocated after a very small number of Europeans had died. And it probably set the tone for the rest of that period of Queensland history. It certainly is quoted in popular writing and in newspapers and by politicians for much of the rest of the 19th century as an example of the savagery of Aboriginal people and the claim that Aboriginal people could never be trusted. So there were a lot of people who used that as an excuse to perpetrate further violence on Aboriginal people.
And the native police were led by white officers, and a number of those white officers had military backgrounds, didn't they? So there was a sense of it, the whole thing being a military process. I wonder, just give us tell us how the term dispersal was used, and I want you to go to, I remember when I first read your book, there is a letter from one of the colonial people who took place in the reprisals for the Hornet Bank massacre, and he wrote to his brother in England. And he was writing in secret because he said to his brother, "Don't tell anyone," which to me absolutely underscored the truth of what he was writing. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, it is a military force. I mean, there is no way around it. It's not a police force. It operates like a military force. And I suspect that there's a lot of military forces operating on the margins of empires that did exactly the same thing and also did not want news of their activities being spread, particularly back in England. The whole concept of dispersal, though, is a very long-standing English tradition of crushing resistance. And I was really impressed recently when I read Ray Evans' piece on the way that protesting in Wales was crushed and people were killed just for standing up for their rights and for food. So it's a long-standing tradition in our British Empire, which we are still part of, now called the Commonwealth, that the authorities not only retain the prerogative to use violence, but they also then make sure that nobody knows about it. So I don't think there's anything particularly special about what happened at Hornet Bank. It was a standard operating practice.
Judy, I stopped by the archive on my way up here this morning to have a look at your exhibition, Skullduggery. Just tell me about it. Because you've had to do your own research to drive your work, haven't you?
No, I have had people like Jonathan Richards and Marg Reed and others.
What I mean is you've had to go on your own journey. Yes.
Sure, personal journey, and then the journey sort of spread out to think about, well, how did these, sort of documents and these categories affect other Aboriginal people? So probably one of the first times was going to a lecture by Loris Williams, who was the first Aboriginal archivist, and Margaret Reed giving a talk on Indigenous people and the right to vote And it was the most amazing lecture, and they had these images of documents and categories and, sort of lists of if you had a preponderance of Aboriginal blood. I didn't even know what that meant, but it means Aboriginality through both sides of the family. You do not have the right to vote. And there was also other documents which I realised would have been used against my family and against all other Aboriginal people in Queensland, because that's what I was looking at. And so I started trawling through documents with the help of many people, and found, after doing the Preponderance of Aboriginal Blood artist book, then went on to think, okay, those documents have been gifted to the Department of Personal Memories and History from the archives, from the descendants of survivors, of people who came through this documentation. And that was fantastic in terms of they wanted to show the rest of the public and the rest of the, sort of nation how their families had been treated. And then I thought, okay, I really need to look at my own family history. And that's when I went in, and later I took my mum in. I had to get my father, and I had to get permission from my grandmother in Mount Isa at that time, and look at this. And I think my grandmother was, everybody was given a number. So I was looking at documents about my grandmother, about my great-grandmother, about other family members. And there was some letters going back and forth from non-Aboriginal members of the family who were protesting against my grandmother marrying a white man, about how it would bring desecration and sort of shame to the family, etc. And when I told my grandmother about it, she laughed out loud because she knew this had been going on. But isn't it funny that those documents got saved in the archives, and all those years later we could look at it and actually see what was happening and face it together.
So where does Lawn Hill Station sit with your story and your work?
Many things. I knew that...
This is in northern Queensland.
Yeah. Lawn Hill and Lawn Hill Gorge, Budjamala. It's the most beautiful place. I don't know if you haven't been there, should go. It's got this amazing subterranean water that comes from the Barkly tablelands, the basin, from deep underneath, and forces its way up through really hair-like fissures in the limestone, and then pops on top of the surface of the water, the skin of the water. And they call it dinosaur water because it's, the same water that dinosaurs would have been drinking, so many years ago. But it's also connected to my family, in that my great-great-grandmother Rosie escaped a massacre at Lawn Hill, and it's recounted by her granddaughter Ruby Saltmere, who came to see my family at my grandmother Grace Isaacson's funeral in 2007, told us this story, and just said, well, yeah, she survived. Ruby knew Rosie, and she had a bayonet wound through her shoulder, through her upper body, which she carried for the rest of her life. And so Ruby tells the story, and I read the story later in Tony Roberts' book, Frontier Justice. And then there's also a previous story that I'd read about. I just came across it in a book at the University of Southern Queensland, University of Sydney library. I opened it up, and it was for a Waanyi Perispheria exhibition that Hetty Perkins, Rachel's sister, and others had put together as part of Bamali. Opened this book, and it was Glenville Pike's Voice of the Wilderness. Opened up and said, at Lawn Hill, sort of a young visitor who was Carolyn Cray was riding through and said the blacks were not the only savages in those days, because at Lawn Hill she saw not less than 40 pairs of blackfellas' ears nailed to the slab hut homestead as reprisal for the spearing of cattle. And that's when I sort of felt it. That's my family. And I wrote, well, I read these words 100 years away. It goes down through blood and memory and soaks into the ground, because that's my grandmother's mother's country. And I think that with me, and probably with a lot of people as descendants, when we see what's in the archives, when we see what's in the libraries or of these books, it hurts you very deeply because, and that's the burden we carry.
Rose, how extensive are the Queensland Archives records with regard to white, colonial and Indigenous conflict, and why did they take so long to come to light?
So with Jonathan's research, and he can probably speak to this more, initially we've found around 4,000, just over 4,000 records that talk about colonial violence, and I think that 4,000 are just more specifically to do with Native police activity. So there's certainly a lot more in there that is not specific. Perhaps it's colonists or private citizens that have been involved in violence. So we know that there's going to be a lot more just in Queensland State Archives. So that's just one institution. And these things take a long time to come to light because it takes a lot of time to physically go through the records. Only 3% or just over 3% of Queensland State Archives records are digitised. So that means if you want to view these records, you have to physically travel to the archive in South Brisbane and sit there in the reading room and go through them page by page. And there's no guarantee of what you're going to find. One record might be 300 pages and have one mention, and another record might be 5 pages and have 20 mentions. So it's really, it's an unknown, and it's something that takes historical researchers their whole careers, like Jonathan has dedicated his career to doing that sort of work.
Tell me about the Tandanya Declaration.
So the Tandanya Declaration was launched or released in 2019, and it's largely based on the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or it's inspired by it, I guess you would say. So it's taken the rights from UNDRIP and applied them to an archival setting. So actually, if you read through UNDRIP, there is a lot in there about the rights of Indigenous people to maintain, control their own knowledges. So there's a huge overlap, or there's a lot that can be applied in UNDRIP to archival practice, and recognising that as Indigenous people, our right to control our own historical narratives is a fundamental right, fundamental human right. So the Tandanya Declaration is an international declaration. And a lot of collecting institutions in Australia have adopted this and are adapting their practice now to give respect and recognition to Indigenous knowledge ownership.
So what will the practical impact of that be? And somewhere in there, I assume this is what you mean by the decolonisation of the archive.
Yeah, well, the conversation about decolonisation is a different one, Kerry, and we can have that another time. But
it's a little big, isn't it?
So there are very practical applications to the Tandanya Declaration. So, for example, Queensland State Archives, they manage records that are created by the Queensland Government and their agencies and departments. So the original perception of ownership with those records is that they always belong to the department that created them. And QSA manages them. They're the guardians for them, but really they have to follow the rules of the original department that created them. So those rules will be around access, and it relates a lot to privacy, but restricted access is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people often feel frustrated about when they're trying to access records about their own families. So things like in the Tandanya Declaration, it advocates for Indigenous ownership of records that relate to them, which is a huge philosophical shift in archival practice.
Rachel, I'm not going to ask you to relive the content you featured in the documentary series because I know it must have been an incredibly harrowing personal experience, but I'm interested to hear of your own research journey for the series, how long it took and whether you were surprised by just how much material was available, was revealed, and by how much you hadn't known yourself.
I rely very much on a number of things. I rely on oral histories passed through families, but I also rely on the work of historians. So someone like Jonathan, who spends 2 decades, going through the archive as been described, I can't do that. I don't have the patience and I'm not a historian who can do that. I'm a filmmaker, so I rely on historians' work often, to a large degree. And this series, like other things I've been involved with, was led often by those books, and 2 of them are here: Secret War by Jonathan, and Every Mother's Son is Guilty, this tome by Chris Owen, which is an incredible work on the history of policing in Western Australia and the warfare there. So I must say that I rely on the historians to a large degree, but it's very much spun, into the past and into the present, because of course we know that history is a continuous line through to now, and so those stories resonate now. So I rely on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've been affected by these histories to tell their story as well. The permission to tell their story and go into their communities and be a conduit through to them. So it's quite a back in time back in time into the present sort of relationship, I think, in forming the story.
So how important do you believe it is to establish that much of the colonial conflict actually amounted to war from the perspective of Indigenous Australians particularly?
War, the definition of war is to use force, I think. Someone will tell me this in the audience. To bend a people to your will. I think that's the definition. And so that's pretty much accepted. And if you look at what happened in Australia, force was used to do a number of things. It was used to occupy land. It was used to exploit people, women, children, men, as labour, and there was resistance to that. So, and I think, as Henry Reynolds eloquently says, if you look at what defines a war, from the Indigenous perspective, of course it was a war. It was a war over our country, and it was a war over a way of life. And as he says, it was a war over this territory we share as our home. And what could be more important than that to us, he says. And, so I think there's no denying it was a war. It was complex because today we understand war as people fighting in a military sense, 2 sides against each other, trenches, This wasn't that sort of war. It was, as it's described, as guerrilla war. It was a moving frontier where people moved in and out of it, and sometimes there were friendships and sometimes there was conflict, and it was a whole mixture of things, and that's what makes it difficult for people to understand. But when you look at the premise of it, what it was driven by, what the outcome was, there is no question that there was war, and on a large scale. And as we know, the evidence is there for it.
And the way you take us through the Tasmanian campaign, for example, and that was a military campaign on the government side, wasn't it? And on the other side, on the Indigenous side, it was fought, as you say, in that guerrilla way. But there was at times quite superior technique applied and strategy applied by the Indigenous people, wasn't there? I mean, it might have been a one-sided war in terms of guns and in terms of numbers, but the Indigenous people were very effective fighters, weren't they?
Indigenous people had the advantage for many, many years, for decades, because, we knew our land and waters. We used that to our advantage. Our warriors were extremely adept. They grew up as hunters. They had an armoury that was efficient, spears and weaponry that was accessible to them. They could travel through the country faster than, the British forces and later colonial forces could. So we had much of the advantage for a very long time. And the great myth in Australia is that our people didn't fight back. That is the great bitter pill that we have in our history, that they tell us that we didn't fight back, you know. And when you go into the archives and you know the stories of our families, and they talk about how here in Brisbane, you know, how in Brisbane they fought back, you know. So this is important because Aboriginal people, in a way, forced the fight. You know, we took the fight to the colonists, and that's a very important part of our history. We can be proud of that, that we resisted to defend our country and people. But of course, in Queensland, you know, as Jonathan said, you know, the very expert colonists, they use the tactic of using our own people to negate the advantages we had. So you see that in the native police. In Queensland, you see it in other places. They use the great tracking skills, you know, Aboriginal men who could live off the land became great horsemen, great marksmen. And, you know, when the superior weaponry came in, the advantages we had, you know, were lost.
Jonathan, I touched on this briefly with you before, but I don't think you answered it. When we look back to the era of the so-called history wars, particularly in the Howard years, where do you think the body of material that has now been unearthed leaves the credibility of those who sought to discredit the early historical work of people like Henry Reynolds and others and yourself, and deny the extent of the massacres? Not just that massacres happened, but the extent of them.
I can tell you what has changed in the last 25 years. Ros Kidd was given unprecedented access to Aboriginal administration files in Queensland, and the Queensland government took her to court trying to suppress publication of those records. She successfully defended that. 25 years later, we're having this event here today with the blessing of the Queensland government. So I think the world has changed, but Keith Windshuttle has not noticed that.
The perpetrators, the soldiers, the native police, the pastoralists and other settlers, combined with the hand of colonial authorities, we know them. There is some measure of their role, but what about the role not just of the formal church, the official church, but of the missionaries and of people who regarded themselves as Christians? God and the Bible were certainly invoked frequently, weren't they, in support of the exterminations?
I do get pretty angry when I hear or read of religious zealots still perpetrating the race line. And there certainly were some religious figures who did stand up against the violence. And there are unsung heroes in Queensland and Australian history. Henry Challinor, Carl Philberg, the Gribbles. I mean, these were people, and sadly most of them are men, who stood up publicly and said this is wrong.
Well, one of the perpetrations of injustice was the way Indigenous people were denied access to the courts. Aboriginals could not give evidence in courts, and in New South Wales that existed until 1878. And one of the reasons proffered was that because they were heathens, they couldn't swear on the Bible because it wouldn't have meant anything.
There's a fundamental contradiction there.
There is.
But I would point out, though, that Aboriginal people did give evidence, particularly in Queensland courts, at things like inquests, and certainly in some of the murder trials and the trials of personal violence. So even though, you know, technically there was this prohibition on Aboriginal people being witnesses, they still did make a huge contribution to the historical record. And it is really a case of just looking and you can find those.
Yeah. Rose, how big a job, and I've always been interested in the oral history side of this, because it seemed to me that for so long, to the extent that Indigenous people had to rely on oral history, ironically even as truths that would have given different, that would have in fact supported that oral history were deep inside the archive and we just didn't know it. But how big a job is it to match up oral history with the written colonial history? And I wonder to what extent that oral history is now vindicated and carries much greater, and we are all forced to give it much greater weight.
Oh, absolutely. And oral history, in archival practice, oral history has only recently been recognised as being a valid record. But the work that is being done in archives now and historical research is serving to affirm what Indigenous people have been passing down as oral histories for generations now. So there's definitely a coming together of the two methods of record keeping and knowledge holding. And I think that's going to be very important when it comes to truth telling.
I thought it was one of the really heartening things about the series was the number of young, highly articulate, credible Indigenous historians who featured in the series. And I mean, they're not relying on oral history. They are across it all. But oral history was clearly a part of your series too. So just give me a perspective on it.
Yeah, well, I think, people have said that oral history isn't a reliable source because it changes over time from one person telling it to the next generation and the next generation, and that it's not legitimate. I think there is an element of truth in that oral history, it moves over generations, but there's problems with all the records, like if you look at the colonial records, they're coming from their point of view, of their version of events. So just because they wrote it on a piece of paper doesn't mean that it's legitimate. I mean, so many of the records we looked at, from Sydney to Tasmania, here to Queensland, those primary sources, people are writing themselves into history and they're covering things up as they go. So you might have Edward Kerr, who's in Tasmania, saying, "Oh, it's so terrible that these women are killed. What a terrible thing. That would never happen here. We would never acknowledge that." And the next minute, he's allowing the boat to be taken and, them to go and massacre 30 people on the beach, and he says nothing about it. So, it's not like primary sources are don't have their own perspectives. But I think the thing about oral history is that that it is a very potent, emotive thing that is there in our communities, and people hold those things very dearly because they've heard it from their grandparents and their grandparents have carried it. Now they are the person who's carrying it. And maybe it's never been in a book, and who cares if it hasn't been in a book, because it was told to them from their grandfather who saw it, and that is a strong history of equal importance. And so many of the oral histories aren't in books and records, and so they're a very rich source for our country to draw on. And it is so good hearing about this decolonising of the records, this truth-telling process that there'll be, Minister Enoch talking today about the process of truth-telling, that will illuminate these oral histories and these stories. It's so long overdue, 200-something years overdue. I mean, just to hear that it's going to happen is so heartening to me and so many people. We're at such an important crossroads in this country, I think.
There is quite a lot of research happening now in other spheres that's marrying up oral histories with, say, climate change or sea level rise. So I think that is part of the shift in understanding the validity of oral history. So there is, for example, there's an Indigenous, I think she's a historian or anthropologist, Jacinda Kilmarty, and she talks about oral history that was handed down through her mob about this big being. And they've realised that that is actually a record of megafauna that occurred in their traditional country. There's also another instance where they've realised that some oral histories or some stories they thought of as folklore actually record sea level rise around Australia now. So increasingly oral histories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are being used to actually validate scientific research as well. So it's almost shifting back the other way. And I will also say, in my experience and my research, I was handed down stories of massacres in my traditional country as well, which I had only heard from my mother and had never, I didn't learn about them in school. None of my friends had heard these stories. They're non-Indigenous. And then through my own research in the archives, I have now come across records that back up these oral histories that I've been told for years in my family and doubted whether they were true or not because no one else knew about them.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to. Judy, you referred briefly to the stories within your own family. This must really resonate for you.
It does, but I was just thinking within the documentary series, I think a really good example is Sturt Creek and how those oral histories were there for so long. A friend of mine had worked with that community, and then it's the ground penetrating research, the archaeological tool, where science is actually allowing us or the people who are doing that research to actually find those burnt and shattered bones and identify that they were burnt for, 6 days continuously.
Because of the volume, the numbers of people, the sheer size of the victims, and endeavouring to reduce the evidence.
Absolutely, and that sort of reducing the evidence is prevalent everywhere. But in terms of a good story, I remember hearing about how Mrs. Donaldson, who was a manager's wife on Riversley Station, where my grandmother was, used to warn the Aboriginal women to hide the children when the troopers, the police were coming through. So you do get those people coming through, and in fact, we did meet, or my sister met his Alan Donaldson, who was a youngest son of Mrs. Donaldson. So, he was very proud of that. But then again, there's other things that they won't accept, other events that occurred at those places. So I think there's, amongst those great stories, there are so many shattering, heartrending stories that you hear about, and then you do find they are matched up with evidence. And that evidence, I'm saying, is finding these things in the archives and having the historians and everybody else be able to pull it out and bring it up. And that's, I think, for artists and, putting filmmakers and everybody within that, that's the whole idea, is to make people feel so they think, and also bring things up to the light and show them and push it towards people so they can't look away.
Rachel, without going again to the detail, but I thought of all the compelling and moving moments in the series, that perhaps one of the most insightful to me and moving was those people standing on that site and knowing that their oral history and what they believed and what they knew had been vindicated. But what it underscored to me was the potent importance of the storytelling, and why that is so important, not just about non-Indigenous Australians knowing properly and well and in a detailed way what the stories are, but for Indigenous people to actually, it's not just a form of release, is it? It's a form of vindication, it's a form of recognition. It just speaks to so many levels. Yeah?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Kerry's talking there about the people at Pukeji Sturt Creek up in the Kimberley. Yes, it's so important to have these stories, well, perhaps not stories, testimony heard. It gives your forefathers and mothers it can't change things, but it gives them some form of justice, or it gives you some sort of release. I mean, I've felt that way myself in going through the archive. I mean, it's very frustrating doing a film like this because the story is so huge, and you feel terrible because you just can't include it. Like, look at Chris's book and the size of that, and that's just, in the Kimberley. Took him 13 years to write that, So it's just such a vast, big story. And I think the only way to do it and to give it justice is to methodically do regional, nation-based histories where, as they do in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as part of this settlement process, the Treaty of Waitangi settlement process, they have historians come in who document what happened to that iwi in relation to their history, and it's tabled. And as well as that, Māori are able to talk about what happened to them in an emotional way and to give their testimony about their history. And I think that is a very important part of it that needs to happen, and the state then then there's the process of, okay, now how do we reset the relationship with the state, given that what has gone on in relation to the colonial government, which is today's government, they carry that responsibility, then it needs to be reset based on what's happened, and in a very methodical process. It's not enough just to tell the history. You've then got to go, okay, now what are we going to do about the past? How are we going to reset this relationship?
So I'm going to make a hopeful assumption here that the referendum to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution will be endorsed around Australia, and that a treaty and truth-telling process will follow. I'm going to assume that states like Victoria and Queensland, and a little further down the track, South Australia, the Northern Territory, is already on this train as well. They're already on their pathways to treaty and truth-telling, are going to deliver the substantial and meaningful processes that they're promising. To play in truth-telling, healing. So what role would you expect the government archives to play in truth-telling, healing and supporting a path to treaty, Rose?
People don't necessarily realise, if you think about the state archives and that is government-produced documents, a lot of people think, oh, it's not really going to be interesting. It's like minutes of meetings and that sort of thing. But what they don't understand is that the government exercised so much control over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lives that there is a plethora of records in government archives. The other side of it is that governments have to be active participants in truth-telling as well. And I mean government departments who their predecessors or their previous iterations were actually the departments or the bodies that administrated this sort of control and sometimes colonial violence. So those governments have to own their stake in that as well.
So, Jonathan, how important do you believe it is to link the truth-telling to the intergenerational trauma that's followed and that's so searingly evident today? Because that is also an important part of this whole process, isn't it? For people, for all of us to actually understand what we see with our eyes of the dysfunction in Indigenous communities and the gaps that we try to measure in inequality, that where this comes from, and that intergenerational trauma as a result of what we're talking about today is at the heart of it.
There's two sides to that, Kerry. The obvious one is the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people right throughout Australia of these policies and practices. But there's also a second element that doesn't really get talked about, and that's what happens to perpetrators. The silence that the violence demands and how it's not passed down through families but this sense of unease. And we've only got to look at this current Royal Commission into veterans, ex-soldiers' suicides to realise that men, and they tend to be particularly men, who are involved in violent activity are also scarred, and their trauma is then visited upon their children and their children's children. So even though we obviously need to look at Indigenous people and the impact of frontier violence, I think it's a mistake to overlook what non-Indigenous people have suffered. And Henry Reynolds put it beautifully in the documentary where he says, you know, these deaths are also being denied as long as we live in a country where nobody wants to talk about the past, where history has become some sort of commodity. It's become something that is denigrated as a profession and as a worthwhile activity. So I think there is a much bigger issue here than just looking at the inequality that Indigenous people have suffered under. I think there's also a whole lot of non-Indigenous people who also have got skeletons that need to be dealt with.
Well, perhaps that's one other aspect of this whole process that will be highlighted, and that is you talk about the denigration of history. I mean, it appears to be going out the door backwards in academic institutions around the country, with rare exceptions, which I just don't comprehend, given how, since my childhood, I've been warned, don't repeat the mistakes of history. Well, the only way you can know not to repeat the mistakes of history is to know the history.
I see it as the end result of neoliberalism and Thatcherist mentalities. Students don't enrol in history because they're told that there is no career coming out of it, therefore they don't study it, therefore it becomes less important. And it's really ironic that if you go into one of the few surviving bookshops left in Australia, the history section seems to be about war and military things, particularly in airports for some reason. So it's bizarre that, you know, there is this flourishing little sector pumping out books about men going off to war in other countries, but we won't talk about war in Australia.
No. I mean, I would say, you know, as I was saying, I was dependent on historians' books, you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but there's only about, 20 books. Like I talked to Ken Burns once, and he said there's 10,000 books written about the Civil War in America. I said, 10,000? Oh, there's about 20 in Australia. So it just shows you that the lack of resources and support that's given to this very important work that historians do. 20 books, a whole continent, over 120 years of warfare.
And also, it goes beyond, historians are doing the research in collecting institutions, but you imagine if that sort of money that has been spent on the War Memorial or the War Memorial in France, I think it was $300 million.
This is the Australian War Memorial.
The Australian War Memorial?
500 million, yeah,
okay, even better.
200 million short, yeah.
So imagine if we had that money in Australia to digitise, transcribe, make available, have research funding for the wars that have happened in this country. We would have a totally different history than we do now.
Just going to come back very briefly without labouring it, Rachel, to that issue of intergenerational trauma and understanding what that means, and in this debate that is developing now and in the truth-telling, that we actually do make links between that history and the intergenerational trauma that results from it.
So once the frontier warfare happened, Aboriginal people became, You know, those that survived became the basically slave labour force for the pastoral industry, certainly in the north. And then if they were still lucky enough to be on their country working for free for the pastoralism, when equal wages came in, they were then removed from their country. So that equal wages happened in the 60s. So my family all worked on cattle stations for no benefit. Those cattle stations, vast pastoral holdings, now occupy all of our country. My family live on tiny little excisions. Some of them who are lucky enough to do that. Most of them don't have their native title. Native title is an expensive, decades-long process that gives you very little rights. As important as the Mabo decision was, it gives us very little rights. We'll never with native title get our country back. Those pastoral stations are worth $20 million up. We'll never have our country back, you know, and this only happened, you know, 100 years ago. So, you know, and now, so all of those people who got kicked off the pastoral stations who were slave labour, who then haven't had jobs, they haven't had the economic benefit of their country, are walking around Alice Springs, you know, my community. So, you know, it's very much with us, this history. It's undeniable what's happened. And the intergenerational trauma, yes, of course, there was the violence and there was the rape, but it's the economic intergenerational trauma of having our economy pulled from us and being treated as slave labour and through generations. And that's something that we deal with every day. So, yes, there is a negotiation to be done with the state. And I'd like to say that it's not all roses. You know, we say that things are changing, you know, governments are changing. Well, that's great. But then why are they fighting native title claims in the court for what little rights we get in Queensland? You know, all across Queensland, the government's opposing native title claims. They're opposing them all across the country. So, you know, for those meagre rights. So, you know, there's still, you know, it's not over. You know, it's changed. The relationship with the state has changed, but there is still a battle going on. It's just in the courts.
And that presumably and hopefully becomes a part of the treaty process. The treaty process will be more than just pieces of paper.
Yes, this long-awaited unfinished business, you know, that we've fought for so long, you know, finally feels like it's within our grasp. And, you know, it will take decades, no doubt, to sort out, but there is hope, you know. There is hope for a change, and that's what we've got to keep striving toward.
Yeah, I think that intergenerational trauma can occur in many forms, and I was thinking about shame being one of them. And that is something that's carried down through, you know, from my grandmother's time down where, you know, she said, oh, people don't want to talk about the past, including herself. And I really pushed because I wanted our family to know more about that. But she also talked about how when she was on various stations she worked on, you know, she was told and threatened that she would be sent to an island. And she said, I didn't know what island it was. I didn't want to go away from anyone and everyone and sort of not see anybody anymore. And I know that some of her family were removed to Mornington Island, Palm Island, you know, various ones. But then there's the exemption certificates too. And so, you know, some of my family ended up getting those where then they were told, yes, okay, so you're exempted, so then you can marry. Not necessarily, you know, it all has to be authorised by the so-called protector, but that supposedly meant you went to associate with Aboriginal people. You had to know the power of money, all of those things. So that's where I find those documents really interesting. And I think that whole shame of being Aboriginal, you know, the threat of kids being taken away, all of that sort of thing, even though we're in this generation now, I think there's still a long way to go. But I do think that hopefully our children won't put up with what was happening in the past and will insist that all of this documentation, all of these histories are out there, and so they don't have to feel ashamed of themselves and their history and of supposedly not fighting back, because they certainly did.
I've got some questions in. what role do objects and the archaeological record play in helping corroborate and expand oral histories in the archival records?
Well, there's quite a few archaeological projects that are happening across the country. So there's and they're featured in the series. So one is an archaeological project into the native police camps that at least tells you where they were. And as Jonathan will tell you, it doesn't say exactly what they did, but we know they were there. So it shows you the the expansion of the native police across Queensland.
And some of them were really quite substantial, weren't they? There's one I think you featured that had quite a lot of buildings.
Yes, some had structures, but they would be designed, as Jonathan will tell you, to be able to move. So there weren't many that were very permanent. But you could find the evidence of the presence of the native police in those places. There's also an archaeological project in Western Australia that looks at the bone fragments, and it's featured in the series, where they look at the size of the bone and they can tell how long it's been burnt for. And so they do that at some places. But of course, that's two projects that I'm aware of. There's more potential, much more potential, I think. But this thing about proving, can I just say something about proving stuff? We are asked to prove it. Always the emphasis is on, we don't believe you, that didn't happen, right? But as Jonathan says, people always talk about numbers too, right? How many? Was it this many? Was it that many? Was it this many? Was it that many? And, we're always forced to talk about numbers. And as Jonathan made the point, well, is it 20,000 people dead after the native police? Is it 50,000? Is it 70,000? Is it 100,000? It's somewhere in there, right? Those numbers, there's somewhere in there, they're right, but we'll never know. And how can we know? And why should we have to prove that when the evidence is there that this state colonial force did that? It's in their reports, in their own words, And 20,000, 50,000, it's terrible, But they want to argue about the numbers all the time. It's just terrible, what happened. So... And we'll never know. And sometimes we'll never know where these places are. Like you look for Aboriginal sites, we'll never know where these things happened. You can't do an archaeological dig across the whole country.
And it's it is massive country to cover.
It's a massive country to cover, and they spent, like you look in Western Australia, by the time they got to Western Australia and the processes they were using to cover their tracks, burning, coming back, burning the bodies, crushing the bones, coming back days later, crushing the bones after they'd burnt them for days and days. They were deliberately covering their tracks. So, and then we're expected to go and find the evidence 100 years later. This is not going to happen everywhere.
Western Australia, I remember one anecdote, I'll come to you in a second, that when the telegraph line started going through and they were using porcelain, and that some very smart Indigenous people discovered that porcelain made great spearheads. So they were knocking off the porcelain. So what did the telegraph people do? They hired bounty hunters to run the line, and how many deaths took place as a result of that process, who knows? So another question, how can we, quote unquote, surface this history more in the public gaze, given that so few read or study history anymore in schools? Films, obviously, but what else?
Well, I think getting it into the schools in the first place is a major thing, getting it into the libraries, not having it closed away. I mean, Uncle Sam Watson talked about how he sees the artists and the, singers and the filmmakers, I'll say that, as being the bards and seers, and they're the people who have to carry those histories and push them through, those gatekeepers. But I think getting them into all those public access, because a lot of people aren't going to go into the big libraries. They just will be too scared or won't know how to traverse them, or the archives. And maybe having sessions, as I know they used to, of know your family history or whatever, and then try and look at it, but bring in a few other things at the same time.
Also, obviously, with the truth-telling process, I know here in Queensland, there are in the preliminary discussions that have been going around, the discussion about how this material is processed back in through the schools is very much a part of it. I'm sorry, Jonathan, I was going to come to you and forgot. What you wanted to add something more to what Rachel was saying.
I was just talking about archaeology. There's two comparisons, and that's the reason why I say I don't know what archaeology can do. I don't know how many hundreds of millions we spent on the Western Front to dig up a handful of Australian soldiers who died there in World War I, and then used DNA to actually identify them, but it was an obscene amount of money. The comparison, though, that I always look at is the Battle of Little Big Horn in the United States, where archaeologists have actually now mapped that battle. They actually know where Custer died. They know who was firing what. They found every bullet and every bone. Yes, okay, it was a fixed battle. It was a lot easier. But it does prove that if there is the will and the resources, it's not impossible. Yes, we do live in a big continent, but I can tell you from my research, the vast majority of Aboriginal people are killed near water. All right, that's a constant feature in all the records that I've seen. It's not that hard. Water's not everywhere in Australia.
And this is where there would have been campsites.
Well, this is what is, it's a flashpoint. Aboriginal people, relied on water. And the colonists who came in, that was the very first thing they did, was block Aboriginal access to watering points. So it's going to be where most of the violence took place. And I'm not really having a dig at archaeology, but I just wish it would look for where the actual violence occurred.
Here's another question. Would you like to see any of what we've been talking about today and what's in the series reflected in the Australian War Memorial, or should the money be spent on the health and well-being of First Nations peoples? Well, I personally don't see why it has to be either or. But let's just concentrate on the first part of that question. Would you like to see this reflected in the Australian War Memorial, Rachel?
Look, I'm just
that's where your whole series started.
Yeah, look, I think I've heard different views from different Aboriginal people about what they think, and I think we have to have a great deal of respect for the Australian War Memorial, because it's a place that honours people who have served their country. And to underestimate that sacrifice and that service I don't want to show any disrespect to that institution. It's an incredibly important one to Australians. And a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people served and still serve in the Australian Defence Force. So it's a very important institution. But I think the institution needs to evolve and needs to be more inclusive of this history of our country. There are other places it can happen. Locally, I think it's very important to give recognition to warfare that happened locally in communities, but I think, like the people who died overseas, sometimes we won't find these places where people were killed. And the War Memorial was set up to acknowledge that, the deaths of those people who died on foreign soil. So, in a way, it sort of has some strange similarity. The death of the people who died in our own country fighting a war, whose place we will never know, where their bodies lie, potentially. We'll never know where these places are. I think it's fitting. It's the fitting institution. It's called the Australian War Memorial. It's not called the Australian War Memorial for war that happened overseas. It's called the Australian War Memorial. So I think that is the place for it, but that is only my view. I know that there's other Aboriginal people who think that they don't want the warfare that happened in the colonial project in an institution that's a colonial institution to some degree and has never had an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person on its board in its 80-year history, by the way. So there's different views. My personal view is that it should be recognised there.
Okay. We've got just a short time left and I want to get through these. There's a reference to somebody who wants to speak. I'll leave that for the moment and see how we go. This is one relating to the archive, Rose, but if anyone else has a point, fine. To what extent are Queensland schools able to engage with the information held in the State Archives about the Australian Wars? And a second one, in the opinion of the panel members, what would be the best way to make this research accessible to Indigenous people? Rose?
So QSA is currently trying to facilitate educators having more access to collections. So just recently, we have been talking with the Queensland History Teachers Association and encouraging school visits and talking to them about what are you teaching, what's in your curriculum, which, by the way, in Queensland has changed very recently to include a lot more Indigenous history and colonial history. So there's a lot of work and there's a lot of good intentions there, but it also requires funding to have research done to be able to make these records accessible. But I think as far as it doesn't always have to be as important as books are. I think the creative arts are really important in telling this story as well and normalising it and almost making it part of pop culture. And if we look at young Indigenous musicians, a lot of them are singing and writing songs about this sort of material now. And I think that in itself, it's unconventional, but that's a new way of memory making that is really important as well.
I'm going to zip through these. How are the troopers of the Queensland Native Police to be represented and remembered in the histories of the Australian Wars? I'll put this to Jonathan and also to Rachel.
That's a really tricky one. There are some Aboriginal people who see them as collaborators. There are some people who don't want their ancestors included in it. It's really important to recognise, though, that the troopers were most often recruited at the point of a gun. You could either join us or you could die. And I don't know, that's a question I ask a lot of people. If you were forced to make that choice, which one would you do? And, you know, it really does come down to a very spur-of-the-moment thing.
And many of them actually absconded, didn't they? Many of them clearly wanted to get away from it. And what happened to them if they absconded and were caught?
They deserted faster than they could be recruited. I mean, that's in the records, all right? That's not just my opinion. The deserters, there's two things that happen to them. They either get shot by the officers who were sent to round them up, or else they make it home to their communities. And I wish we had a movie about the groups of young Aboriginal men who walked the length of Queensland to escape serving in the Native Police. I reckon that's one of the best bravery stories in our national history. Nobody's made a film of that one yet, Rachel, perhaps?
Was there any place or event you found especially moving and why? I think I'd put this to you, Rachel.
Oh, it's just too much.
Yes.
You know, like every time I talk about it, I'm just on the verge of tears all the time. You know, it's just so tough. The stakes were so set against Aboriginal people, you know, so it's very difficult. And, you know, like we thought in some ways that we should, you know, like in First Australians, which was another documentary series we did, we often had a lot of white voices who, you know, spoke out against it to give people something to hang on to. And there were people like that, but they were rare, you know. And so in this, I was going to do that as a sort of tactic, say, oh, here's Carl Friedberg, famous Queenslander, spoke up against it. But, you know, he was quite rare, wasn't he, Ray? And so to push him forward would sort of thwart the record in what was really a general acceptance. So, yes, there was so many stories, so, yeah.
And the Mile Creek massacre, where the determination that it was actually driven from the top, the Attorney General, an Irishman, and the new governor, when he came in, Gibbs,
Yes.
insisted on those prosecutions, and when they were acquitted on the first murder, they were charged again, and 7 were hanged.
Yes,
but that
a
was.
very
Am I
rare
right
moment.
that this is the only successful prosecution?
That's right.
Against perpetrators of violence against Indigenous people.
Yes, and we talked about that case and whether we should include it. A case near, in New South Wales, Gamilaroi people, but again, it's so rare. Like, it's the only time it's happened, and it did change things because killing went underground. But it's just one exception.
But they did say that after it became overt, that, more and more killings occurred, but were not spoken of, and it was really pushed underground after that.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting that, that case was solved because of a child's jawbone.
Right.
And that was one of the few things that they found.
Yes. There's a person here who's written, "I'm a descendant of the Central Queensland massacres that Jonathan's book refers to. I would like to share my story with the panel today." We've got a microphone coming to you.
Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara Turrbal people and the country that we are gathered on. Didn't think I was going to speak today. I actually came to see a very dear old friend of mine, Rachel Perkins, and my friend Judy Watson, who's speaking, was part of the panel. And I let Judy know that I was coming today. So I actually didn't expect that Jonathan would bring up the narrative of what happened up in Hornet Bank. And I just wanted to let you know that my family was one of the families whose men were massacred at Banana Creek, which runs on the Dawson River. My great-great-great-grandfather, William Toby I, was the singular remaining descendant of the Eastern Gungaloo males. And so I'm a very proud descendant of his, and I'm very glad that we have survived despite our generational trauma and the fact that my grandmother, Nellie Sheridan, and my mother, Viola Sheridan, like Auntie Leslie, were sent out to work for no pay for decades. But I'm very glad to be able to say that they spent the rest of their lives quietly agitating and advocating for the reparations of stolen wages here in Queensland. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone here who would like to respond to that, please do.
I just want to say thank you for your courage. It's not easy to talk about things like that, particularly when it's in your own family. I've had the utter privilege of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people right across Queensland, and in particular working with people from the Dawson River. And I think it's one of the things that changed my view is their unfailing good humour, perseverance and courage, that despite these awful, awful things that happened in the past, these people still continued to care for country. And they still continued to welcome someone like me, who they didn't know from a bar of soap, into their families and into their lives. And I've been so lucky to have met so many wonderful Indigenous people, and there's been a lot of non-Indigenous people too who've also encouraged my work. But it's hearing stories like that that gives me the strength to keep going in the archives year in, year out, because I think this is worthwhile. You know, I'm going to do some good. I'm not just doing it for my own entertainment. And I think,
get paid for it so much, so
but getting this material out there and you know, in this hope that we will have a better tomorrow is, I think, that's the only reward we can all hope for. So thank you for your courage.
Yes, and the Hornet Bank massacre was going to be featured in the series. We shot material for it, and at the end of the edit, like, we had to, it's like cutting off fingers basically, as we had to drop scenes to get to 58 minutes of television. But that is an incredible story, and of what happened, and great, Michelle, that you tell that story with such dignity. Very moving, and it was really very difficult to cut it out. But of course, that massacre was because the young men were raping the local women, and the mother of the young men pleaded with other people to get the men to stop, and they didn't stop. And so then the family, including her, was massacred as a result. And then the native police were brought in, as Jonathan said, and for years they went out killing every Aboriginal person they could see, because the Aboriginal men stood up to the raping of their women. So it's you know, it's a terrible story, but it's also a story of survival, isn't it?
Okay, on that note, this has been, I think, a very special and important conversation, and Rachel in particular, congratulations for the series.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be fascinated and hopeful about how Australians respond to it. Would you please give your appreciation for our panellists today?